you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to turn to Philippians chapter 1. I love a good story, don't you? I love a good testimony. And those are the things that give us courage and strength during times when we ourselves are put in a position where we need to get on the faith train. Right, Jan? I mean, that's exactly what that story is about. In Philippians chapter 1, a passage of Scripture that those of you who have put up with my preaching for the last 20 years know is one of my favorite passages. The Apostle Paul is writing a church that had a special relationship with him. And I don't think you should ever read the book of Philippians without first reading Acts chapter 16, where you discover that Paul had other plans, but God directed him specifically to Philippi, and then a number of amazing things happened there, and a partnership developed there. But in verse 3 of chapter 1, the Apostle Paul says, "I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for you, I always pray with joy because of our partnership in the gospel from the very first day until now, being sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it." In verse 7, he says, "It is right for me to feel this way about you because I have you in my heart, so that whether I am in chains or confirming and defending the gospel, you know how I long for you with all of my heart." That scripture, to me, gives the very essence of what it means for a congregation and a pastor to become one, to become individuals who are partnered together in the gospel, so that when the congregation does something, someone in the congregation does something, it's an extension of everyone. When the pastor does something, it is an extension of everyone. When the Apostle Paul is in jail, it's an extension of the church. When he's defending the gospel, it's an extension of the church. Our journey began before I got here, quite frankly. It began over in that little white building there behind you. The interim pastor here, Reverend Rick Cook, was meeting with the board. And back then, some of you, I don't want to call you old timers, but I'm going to get in trouble now if I name names, but people like Kathy Gowan and Gary Edwards were on the board back then, and Frank Ketley, who's gone on to be with Jesus, other individuals. They met together as a leadership team, and Pastor Rick asked that group what they believed the future could be like for Lamont Wesleyan Church. And one of the ways that he did that is he gave them note cards, and he asked them to write what they thought the attendance of Lamont Wesleyan Church could be someday. And just so you know, just to put yourself in that position, this was shortly after Reverend Busby had passed away. The church was running around 30. There were those who thought the church was going to close at this time. And Bud McKenzie, who went to be with the Lord, I think it was in 2007, 2008, Bud liked to push us. And I'm just curious, because I know there are many of you who are new. How many of you knew Bud? Remember Bud? Probably a little over half of us. And of course, Julie, you remember Bud. Absolutely. And Bud wrote on a piece of paper 222. 222. That group of people began to believe in God in some amazing ways. And they were led through a book that talked about the way that God is experienced. It's called Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby. And the basic idea was, and this is important for us to remember because this will always be our journey together. This is how God has worked in our congregation. God is at work in the world. We believe that. We believe that his desire is to have a relationship with every single person in the world. And he invites us into that journey. And he speaks to us. He speaks to us through his word, through the congregation, through circumstances, through the Holy Spirit. And he asks us to do things that challenge our faith. And so our basic belief as a congregation, as individuals, is that we do not ask God to bless what we are doing. We don't believe that's biblical. We believe we ask God, what are you blessing so that we can do it? He's the one in charge. He's the one calling the shots. And we believe that his blessing comes when we align ourselves with him and his purposes. And so sometimes that requires us to take huge steps of faith, to sacrifice, to become uncomfortable. But what we believe is that as we do that, we experience the power of God as he does what only he can do. And so as we stand out here, there's things that we can see that God has done. When that little group met and Bud wrote 222, this house right here did not exist. In fact, it wasn't even thought of. That was 1997, I believe it was, when that meeting took place. In 2000, as a group, you decided, I was still just coming into this picture, that God was calling you to hire a full-time pastor in spite of the fact that most people thought that you should be closed. And you believed that you needed to build a parsonage to do that. And so you, in response to God's direction, began to build. And that place there was built debt-free by us and those who helped us. We had churches from around the state that came and helped and benefited us in many ways. But that house exists because of you. And we moved into this house, Samantha and I and the two kids, as that house was being finished, and moved into that house a month or two after we arrived. So Jabin, just so you know, Andrew and Kara had to live in this house for a little while. You and Allie are living in this. It's just a tradition, okay? It's like I don't know. It's just a tradition. We'll leave it at that. It is a rite of passage. The church began to grow in amazing ways. Bud and I had a concern. We felt that the church was led almost exclusively at that time, other than Bud and I, by females. And you know that I believe, and not just believe, I believe the Bible teaches that women are leaders in the church and preachers and teachers. We see that all through the book of Acts and in other places. And so it isn't that we're against that, but we were unbalanced. And Bud and I began to pray. And in that first 2 years, God sent us people like Dan Kraft, Dave and Jan, Eric and Kim. These names will mean something to some of you. For others of you, you might not know all these people. Ray and Judy, Paul and Nancy, Virgil and Linda, Vance and Kelsey. And God did an amazing thing. And I remember the day that we decided we needed to build. I remember it because, we were running like 160 in that little building over there, and it was crazy, and people were attending that didn't know that other people that their friends were attending, because we were a split congregation, half in the fellowship hall, half in the sanctuary, and I stood in the middle and preached to both sides. We wanted to build, but the idea we thought it cost us like $300,000 to build, and that was a lot of money for a little congregation that was scheduled to be closed a few years before that. And I'll always remember, and I warned him of this, I always remember Steve Roth, who isn't the first one to get up and speak at a business meeting, standing up and saying to us, in essence, what more does God have to do to tell you that it's time to build? And so I told him, well, Steve, write a huge check. No, I didn't. I'm just kidding. But we knew that God was speaking through him. And so we made arrangements. And I know for some of you this is like old hat, and I'm sorry, but we've got to remember the stories as it prepares us for all the things God has for us. We decided we would start building if we had $150,000 in the bank. And frankly, some of us thought that would never happen. And the very first offering that we took up, when we were done, we had $217,000. And it's like, why did we wait so long? Where was our faith? And I remember the day that Elmerat and other men took that communion table and carried it right down this road into that building. And what a great day that was. And I remember in 2007 doing our statistical report. We don't really care about numbers that much, but the denomination does, and so I got to turn in reports every year telling them about offerings and attendance, and we sort of laugh. We say budgets, and buildings sometimes is all some people care about. But I remember doing that statistical report, and we did it in a spreadsheet, so there wasn't any cheating. And our attendance that year was 222, our average attendance. And Bud got to see that. It was during that time that God began to change our vision. We began to see that while it was amazing what God was doing here, and we got up to close to 300 in this building, and we began to see that people were driving from long distances to come, but the farther a person drove, the less likely they would be to bring their non-Christian friends to church. And God began to lead us to work in other areas. And one of those areas, I don't know if you can hear me, one of those areas was Burlington. Do I need to just grab another mic, David? Am I good? One of those areas was Burlington. And I'm not going to tell all that story, but we started another campus, and we were doing things that many did not believe a rural church would ever do. It was during that time, though, that God began to speak to us about a different way of looking at church. Rather than viewing church like a lake, to view it as a river. Rather than judging our success by how much we could gather, how large the lake could be, but to begin to judge our success by sending people, by how much we could send, how big of an impact that we could have. We believe, and it is our fundamental belief about every one of you, and I mean this about every one of you, that when God knit you together in your mother's womb, He did it because He had a specific mission for you to accomplish. And the role of the church is to help you find what God has called you to do, and then do all that we can to help you do that very thing. We went from we can do it, you can help, to you can do it, and we are called to help you do that thing. I'm reminded of Acts chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, where this church at Antioch has all these different kinds of people from different places, different countries. It's a vibrant church, but they prayed together, and God said to them, send Paul and send Barnabas, your two leading preachers, teachers, and encouragers, send them on a missions trip. And they did exactly that, and most of our New Testament involves their journey and the results of that journey. Even the very passage we're looking at today in Philippians is a result of a decision of a church at Antioch to send rather than accumulate people. This was not an easy journey for us. We found it true what Blackaby taught in his book, that sometimes when you do what God calls you to do, it hurts, it stretches you. We as a congregation started Radiant Life Church in the Burlington, New Strawn area. It was challenging, it was painful. Not all of it went the way that we expected it to go. But here's what we know. Today there is a vibrant church in New Strawn, Kansas, proclaiming the gospel. And we are the mother of that church. We are the ones who God used to start that church. And then out of that church, Dave and Shauna went to Iola and started the Watershed, and God is doing amazing things in there. As we think about the river, we realize that in Iola today, there's a group of people that are meeting that have flowed out of us. And then for some, going, because we went from, connect, grow, serve to come, grow, go. For some of us, going involves living right here, but ministering in other places. And Haiti became something so important to us. And I'll be honest, Jan, I did not know you were giving your testimony today before this sermon, but there has been difficulty with both Jola and Jan experiencing physical challenges and the country being closed. But today there is a house being built, Sunflower House, that Jan's already talked about, directly flowing out of this congregation that chose to be a river. Up in Emporia, Pastor Mark came to us and said he was called to plant a church. And Embrace Church is being born out of us as we again send. Sometimes that sending was very difficult. The day that we released Virgil and Linda to go back to Hartford was a challenging day for me. People we loved, but people have been baptized, and a little church is being revitalized because we released, we sent. Some of our sending involves jail ministry. Melissa isn't here this morning, but like 3 weeks ago, she shared her testimony as Freedom and Faith Ministries started a jail ministry as she began to find, as Melissa found her passion, what God had called her to do. And I believe there will be jail ministries all over the state as a result of Freedom and Faith Ministries. Because someone found their passion, they found what they're called to do. And there are many of you. I could spend so much time, every one of you. It might be where you work, it might be your home, it might be where you go to school, it might be something you do online, but God has called you. He's given you gifts. Just yesterday I was over talking to Lacey, who's hiding behind the tree over there. Went to art school, wasn't real sure what God, she's an amazing artist, just so you know. As our dog came to the end of his life, she painted a picture of Casey for us. It's just amazing. But here she is using her artistic ability to prepare for VBS. And if you go over there, you'll see in the church, you'll see dinosaurs and all sorts of other artwork where a person finds what they're called to do and they do it. We've become a church that sends. And today I want to talk to you about another sending. In the middle of all of this, especially probably one of the more painful times for me personally, not in a sense that it was a bad kind of pain, it was a good kind of pain, but when we launched Radiant Life Church, that was such a challenge. That was in January of 2017 that we made that decision, and it was Easter of 2017 that we launched them. It was that summer that God began to bless us. He saw a willingness for us to be open-handed, and He began to expose me to a group called Exponential, and I began to travel more, and I saw this huge need. There were all these ministries that were designed to help people start new churches and designed to help churches turn around, and none of them focused on rural ministry. It was like we didn't exist. And God gave us a place where we could begin to talk about that. It was 2017 on Thanksgiving Day that I posted on Facebook that I was thinking God might be calling us to start something to minister to rural churches and to help rural towns that don't have a life-giving, Bible-believing, community-transforming church, to help them. And there was this guy in North Carolina who was supposed to be deer hunting, but instead had his phone out. I don't know how he expected to get a deer that day. Maybe he didn't feel like processing one. I don't know. But he messaged me. And I think Andrew and I both knew that day that he was coming here. And Andrew and Kara left everything They resigned their church without telling us, by the way, just so you know. And God called them here, and we didn't know what to do. We had no position for them. We had no money for them. I mean, they have 4 kids. They actually have mouths to feed. But they were coming. And in a situation that's hard to talk about because we want to honor confidentiality. But by the time that they got here, Dirt Roads Network was in a place where they could take most of my salary and pay it. And we had money to pay Andrew and Kara. And they came on, and what an amazing ministry they've had these last 2 years. I don't think I've ever seen a pastoral family fit in so quickly into a community. And it's probably just because they have well-behaved, beautiful children. They're sitting on the front row today. At least 3 of them are. They have to. Oh, they're... Hi, Maggie. She didn't hear me. God sent them to us. I could not even begin to imagine what the last 2 years would be like. Today, Dirt Roads Network has official relationships with several regions of the Wesleyan Church. Through this COVID-19 thing, we have helped pastors who did not understand how to get online very well, who didn't understand the political dynamics of restarting church, that people would actually see that differently, and we were able to help them through that, and just an amazing door has opened. And today Dirt Roads Network ministers to literally hundreds of churches, and the door is wide open for more. And so it was in a time very similar to Acts chapter 13. It says that the church of Antioch, while they were praying and fasting, God spoke to them, and God said, "Set apart for me Saul and Barnabas," Saul soon to be Paul. Right before COVID-19, in a prayer retreat, we as a leadership team felt very clearly that God was calling for me to transition to a new position. Now, when a pastor says that, everybody starts looking for the U-Haul. That is not what we're talking about. What God has asked me to do is to step down from being the lead pastor of Lamont Wesleyan Church and to become your full-time missionary to rural America. This has become our home. I mean, you guys are our home. We love you. And short of God calling us in, like, I don't know, coming to us in lightning and thunder, and short of God changing the plan, our desire is to live here, to minister with you and for you around the country, but no longer as the lead pastor of this church. This church deserves someone whose main focus is you, whose main focus is Madison and Gridley and Hamilton and our surrounding communities, who God has called to lead. And when I'm done with this sermon in just a few minutes, I'm going to ask Pastor David to come up, and he's going to talk to you about what the next steps are, how that takes place. But I just want to go on record as saying I believe that God has called Andrew and Kara to this place. And they have embraced us, and we have embraced them. And I am looking forward to serving Andrew as he leads as my senior pastor once we get all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. But what I want to say to you today, having told you that I feel God is transitioning us to a different position here at the church, is I want to say on behalf of Samantha and Andrew and Rebecca, thank you. Thank you for loving us so deeply, which you have done these last 20 years. We came here, we were city slickers. We weren't like Andrew and Kara. They knew country. They could talk country. I mean, Andrew knew how to process a deer and was even late to church, like his second time here officially as pastor, because he was out spoonbill fishing. So, I mean, I have to hold that over his head a little bit. But thank you for loving us, even though we didn't fit at first. It took us 20 years to figure that out. Thank you for modeling a healthy church to our children. So many pastors' kids, when they get to be 18, they're gone. They don't want to have anything to do with the church. We have 2 adults, and yes, we're thankful that they don't want to live in our basement, especially since we don't have a basement. We're thankful that they have good jobs, they're financially secure, all that stuff. We're thankful for that. But more than that, we're very thankful that they have a positive view of Christianity, a positive view of the church, that they're involved in their local churches serving. Andrew is about to become a worship leader for a while, at least, at his church during an interim time. Thank you for showing my children what church should be like. And thank you for taking so many steps of faith. What an amazing adventure. As I told that story, I left out 75% of it. Because it seemed like every 18 months or so for the last 20 years, God has stretched us and we've responded, and the results have been amazing. Thank you for going on that journey with us. Thank you for the sacrifice. In 2005, I came across a poem/reading. It doesn't really rhyme that well, but it's written with a sense of pace. And I shared it with the congregation at a business meeting. And I think it really does describe the journey we have been on. Jan used the example of a train. This is an example of a bike ride. And so I'd like to end this sermon with this story and just think about how it reflects our lives together and how it can be your life as well. It's called The Bike Ride, and the author is unknown. At first, I saw God as my observer, my judge, keeping track of the things I did wrong, so as to know whether I merited heaven or hell when I die. He was out there sort of like a president. I recognized his picture when I saw it, but I didn't really know him. But later on, when I recognized my higher power, it seemed as though life was rather like a bike ride. But it was a tandem bike, and I noticed that God was in the back helping me pedal. I don't know just when it was that he suggested we change places, but life has not been the same since. Life with my Jesus, that is, God makes life exciting. When I had control, I knew the way. It was rather boring but predictable. It was the shortest distance between 2 points. But when he took the lead, he knew delightful long cuts, up mountains and through rocky places at breakneck speeds. It was all I could do to hang on. Even though it looked like madness, he said, "Pedal." I worried and was anxious and asked, "Where are you taking me?" He laughed and didn't answer, and I started to trust. I forgot my boring life and entered into the adventure. And when I'd say, "I'm scared," he'd lean back and touch my hand. He took me to people with gifts that I need, gifts of healing, acceptance, and joy. They gave me their gifts to take on my journey, our journey, God's and mine. And we were off again. He said, "Give the gifts away. They're extra baggage, too much weight." So I did, to the people we met. And I found that in giving I received, and still our burden was light. I did not trust him at first in control of my life. I thought he would wreck it. But he knew bike secrets. He knew how to make it bend, to take sharp corners, jump to clear high places filled with rocks, fly to shorten scary passages. And I'm learning to shut up and pedal in the strangest of places. And I'm beginning to enjoy the view and the cool breeze on my face with my delightful, constant companion, my Jesus. And when I'm sure I can't do any more, he just smiles and says, pedal. I want to thank you for joining me on this bike ride. David, if you'd come on up.
Thank you, Pastor Steve. I was praying for you personally as you were going through that, because that had to have been, I know you've been thinking a lot about how to say what you needed to say right there. And the 20 years that we have been, or close to that, been a part of this congregation is, we all have our own story in regard, and these like you, Steve.
Yes, they do.
We all have our story connected to this congregation in some way, and I think of numbers of board meetings where we talked about.
He's coming up to you too, David. The joys of outdoor ministry.
I was trying to get this done quicker than my wife. Oh, I did. She did ask me to say something. One thing that she did not say, so I'll have to step out. She told me she was going to be the one spiderwebbing, so now it's me. She said that she did want you to know that from her last report, the tumors continue to shrink, and in fact, in some ways, they're not even sure they're alive, and so we're thankful for that. Anyway, my part of being on the Lamont Wesleyan Church board has come from the time in which it was that smaller congregation, but I just want to call out some of those that had continued to fight the fight for so long and maintained something that has now become extremely special, not just in Lamont, but in other places. And I think through all of that, what I have learned so much is that God is calling us, and Pastor Steve alluded to that, to do things that 12 months ago we wouldn't have thought about. And he has always been very much impressed upon our minds and our hearts of how he changes the direction, not his will, but just a direction for us in which to serve him better. And so that has always been very present, and I can't thank all of you for giving me that chance to serve. And I also got to serve underneath Bud McKenzie, which was a unique opportunity in and of itself. If you never had the chance to work with Bud, he was quite special to work with, but a great leader. And as Pastor Steve alluded to, this has been something that we have, as a board, wanting to share with you for some time, and certainly the last 3 or 4 months have been a challenge in a lot of different ways, but to be transparent, to be really able to communicate to you this transition. And even though some of you may have felt that, some of you may even ask questions about that, and maybe you have anticipated that there is some change happening, there was never really the opportunity for us to be able to share that in this type of a format. And even though we were thinking about having the annual board meeting today, we decided to push that off a couple of weeks so that we could lay the groundwork for what is happening. But as Pastor Steve has always been one that is in tune with God's voice, and his ear has always been turned to that, this direction and this opportunity for something that Pastor Steve has been involved with for the last 20 years here is no doubt moving in a direction of serving the Lord in an outward way. And I think that group that kept this small pond together as it became a lake. And as that lake got so overwhelming, we talked as a board so many different times about being better at discipleship. But when we look back, and Gina and I was doing this the other day, we look back at the number of people that have left here and gone and done and are doing miraculous things. Maybe we didn't miss every step on discipleship that we thought we did. But we did know, and we felt overwhelmingly, that we were being called to be moving outward, like that river that Pastor Steve has talked about this morning. So I thank God for that calling that Steve heard. I thank you for the time that he has devoted to this 20 years, and not that he's leaving, his role is just changing. And as a board, we had to recognize that, and we wanted to honor that. And so we have began that process. And I can't illustrate this enough to say also that that how fortunate we are to have had Pastor Andrew and Pastor Kara come into our midst. It's not by chance. They are here for this time, and it is a special time that we are about to see unfold before us. In a couple of weeks, we'll talk about the budget that has been prepared. We're still going to honor Pastor Steve and Samantha. They will stay in this parsonage as long as they wish. And we will still pick up some of their expenses. And Pastor Steve will still be engaged in some of the things that are happening within the church, but those roles will be slightly shifted. And the board has and wants to recommend to you in 2 weeks that we will vote, we will present to you Pastor Kara and Pastor Andrew to take over that lead responsibility. And we will ask for your vote at that point in time. It's not a vote between Pastor Steve and Kara and Pastor Andrew. It's a vote towards what God's will is and where God is calling us to be. And so that's what we as a board want to present to you at that point in time. You know, Steve, it's been quite a journey, and the emotions that you expressed this morning, I think all of us felt, and even though it seemed like a little bit of a reunion of telling stories of what has happened here, it's never old to hear that same story again. And for what you have done, and the pond that is developed into a lake, and the lake that is now flowed out, because of that and hearing that voice and your dedication to it, there is going to be churches all around this country that will benefit from your leadership. And Steve, I can't thank you enough as a lead board member, but to commemorate that, we want to present you something this morning, because a man cannot go down a river without a watercraft. So somewhere there should be a couple of guys coming around the corner with something to allow you to do that. Recently, Pastor Steve has been a little bit like me, a bachelor, because his wife likes to camp. But when Steve does have a chance to go to the lake, he likes to spend a little time on the water in a kayak. So Pastor Steve, it is our honor to present to you this morning, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
And over the next couple of weeks, as we approach the 12th of July and that board meeting, and encourage you to be here if at all possible. We will go over more details at that point in time and really kind of iron out the budget and any questions that you might have, and to take votes not only on Pastor Kara and Andrew, but also some board members as well. And catch any one of us if you do have any questions.